So we're working our way through the Gospel according to St. Mark, and we've gotten as far as chapter 8, which tells us that during those days, another large crowd gathered. Now, when Mark tells us that what we're about to read happened during those days, he's referring to a strange period, if I can put it that way, in Jesus' life, where the deeply religious Jesus left Israel and went somewhere he really shouldn't have gone, called the Decapolis. And the reason Jesus shouldn't have gone there is because for a first century religious person, the Decapolis is about the most irreligious place one could imagine. So a few Sundays ago I taught you that in the 2-3 centuries before the birth of Christ, the culture of ancient Greece was very deliberately superimposed upon the cultures of the Greek and subsequently Roman empires. And in most parts of the world, that was welcomed as a breath of fresh air. Greek culture was very sophisticated. Roman culture, very sophisticated. So if you came from some backwater in some corner of the world, this was great. However, in the traditional, conservative, and insular culture of Israel, this clash between Greek culture and Jewish culture created enormous tensions. So we spoke about the Greek gymnasiums, and we said that conservative Jews did not particularly appreciate public nakedness. And yet all over Israel, Greek gymnasiums were opening, and the custom at these gymnasiums was you worked out in the nude, because in Greek thinking the human body was the ultimate expression of beauty, so it was impolite to cover it up. We spoke about eroticism. Conservative Jews did not particularly appreciate public displays of sexuality, and yet all over Israel, Greek theatres, which often build highly erotic dramas, became hot ticket items. We spoke about education. Conservative Jews very much appreciated the learning of the Torah, the books of Moses. And yet all over Israel, this traditional learning was being abandoned in favour of Greek learning, done by Homer and Plato and Euripides and people like this. So what you find happening in the centuries just before Christ and just around Christ is that young, traditional Jews are essentially abandoning their Jewishness in favour of what was thought to be the more sophisticated culture of Greece. Some young Jewish men were even going as far as getting reverse circumcisions done so that they could work out naked at the Greek gym and no one would know they were actually born Jewish. Now, in Jesus' day, the most Greek part of the ancient world was an area that the Bible calls the Decapolis. This is, as the name suggests, 10 cities just outside of Israel. And what we need to know about these 10 cities is that in Jesus' day, they were more Greek than Athens was. They were... It was, to a first century Jew, it was like Greek Disneyland. So it was here that a young Jew could find the best gymnasiums to work out in. It was here that a young Jew could find the best Greek tutors to learn the best Greek ideas. It was here that a young Jew could see the best Greek dramas at the best Greek theatres. It was here that a young Jew could forget that he was Jewish and thoroughly immerse himself in all things Greek. By the way, in the famous story that Jesus tells about the prodigal son, remember it says he left for a far-off land? That far-off land was probably the Decapolis, because in the first century, this is where you went when you wanted to abandon the religion of your forebears and adopt a new, more liberal way of life. So, verse 1. During those days, that is, while Jesus left the safe, conservative culture of Israel and went to Greek Disneyland, to talk to people who had abandoned everything they'd been taught as children. While Jesus did that, while he was there, we're told, curiously, that a large crowd gathered. Now, the word gathered that Mark uses in verse 1 is a particularly intensive form of the word. And in using this form, Mark is being careful to tell us that this particular crowd gathered around Jesus with no small amount of enthusiasm. So this is weird, is it not? These may very well be the kind of people who enjoy working out naked at the gym whilst reading Plato. These may well be the kind of people who, for entertainment, go and check out an erotic drama at the theatre. These are almost certainly the kind of people who, by their lifestyle, have made themselves an anathema to their religiously minded parents and grandparents, but they are nonetheless rather interested in what Jesus has to say. And I mention that to you because I think it's important to understand that just because a person rejects religion as we know it and as we practice it, does not mean that they reject religion itself. The same goes for values, the same goes for morals, and the same goes for principles. Not a single one of these people would have darkened the door of a place of worship in their home village back in Israel, but they still have souls. And the soul has a way of always being hungry. So please don't think that just because that person you love deeply has rejected something of the values and something of the principles and something of the morals and something of the religion that you were raised with and that you raised them with, please don't think that that means that they don't have morals and they don't have values and they don't have principles. We believe, remember, that people are fundamentally decent and good. And that decency and goodness is a hunger within them. And it has a way of working itself out. Give people the space to have their own spiritual journey and path through life. It doesn't look like yours, and would you want it to anyway? Give them the room. This screams at me from this sentence. None of these people have a normal spiritual journey. They've all rejected it, and yet they're all here listening to Jesus. And notice the detail in the text. They've been doing it for 3 days. I'm quite religious, and I'm not sure I could manage that. They can. Then in the next sentence, Mark tells us that since they had nothing to eat. Now, I might be reading too much into it at this point, but it's fascinating to me that twice in the Gospels, it's said of the people who live in this Greek Disneyland that they have nothing to eat. And my theory is that the reason they have nothing to eat is because they went to this place to have a good time. And they had a good time. But in having a good time, they spent all their money on having a good time. And they never had any money left for food. I think they probably made good life choices. But that's the consequence. And so what Jesus is looking at then is a predominantly young, skinny, hungover crowd. Right? Jesus is talking to the morning after Woodstock here. I'll try to use cultural references people of your age can relate to. Doesn't seem to be working. Right? Okay? That's the crowd. This is a morning after the night before crowd. This is a crowd of consistently strange life choices. And they've spent all their money on having a good time and haven't saved any of it for food and bills and stuff like that. Alright? Jesus, look at what it says, called his disciples to them and said, I have compassion for these people. If I send them home hungry, they'll collapse on the way home because they've come a long distance. Stop, please, on the word compassion. The word compassion in Mark's Gospel, in fact in all of the 4 Gospels, is is a Greek medical word that means down here. It means down here in your gut. And the ancient writers used this word to describe what a person was doing when they were feeling life at its most intense. Do you know how when you're feeling anxious, you sometimes feel it down here? When you're feeling scared, you sometimes feel it down here. A whole bunch of life's emotions. You don't feel them in the head, in the heart. You feel them in the gut. It's just something deep down inside of you. And so in the ancient world, these writers used this Greek word, spangolizomai, which literally means entrails, to describe what a person was doing when they were feeling life deep, deep down. So notice, please, then, what Mark is telling us about Jesus. Mark is telling us that as Jesus looked at this emaciated crowd of young party people and he saw where they were at in life, he didn't just feel them, he felt them. And he felt them deep, deep down in his gut. I need to mention that to you because it's important to remember when you read the Gospels that Jesus wasn't British or Canadian or Scandinavian or anything like that. His was a Mediterranean temperament. His was an Italian, a Spanish, a Near Eastern way of emoting. He didn't just feel things, he felt things. And so when you read through the Gospels and you notice that Jesus had compassion on this person or that person because of the things they were going through, it really forces you out of the Gospels and into your life and makes you ask the question, does God love me? Does he know what I'm going through? Does he care? And in sentences like this one, we get a welcome glimpse into the emotional life of Jesus. He doesn't just notice. He feels what he notices. So in Christian theology, we believe that God knows all things, both possible and actual, in a single moment. That is, that as God looks at your life, he knows everything that you are and everything that you could be, and that his knowing is emotional. So as you endure those difficulties that make your life far harder than you wish it were, as you put a brave face on your inner pain for another day, as you hide it from those you love for their sake for another day, as you do whatever you have to do to get through the morning one more time, just to get through it, we believe in Christian thinking that God not only knows what you're going through, he feels it. He feels it emotionally. So Jesus then isn't one of those friends who you meet for a coffee, and when you share what you're going through, he's looking over your shoulder or looking at his watch because he's got somewhere better to be. Jesus is one of those friends when you share what you're going through, the tears are streaming down his face because your pain becomes his. And I think this matters because understanding what God is like helps us understand where we are with him, particularly when it all falls apart. We are loved. And for me, one of the big mysteries of the gospel is that Jesus actually cares. That's something to meditate on in our Christian prayers this week. Jesus doesn't only know what you're dealing with. He cares. Not here. Not even with his ears, but down here in his gut. Anyway, so Jesus, he looks out at the crowd and he says, look at these people, they're hungry. Got to give them something to eat. Next sentence, his disciples answered, but where in this remote place would we find enough to feed them? And I know what you're thinking, because you're smart, you were in church 2 weeks ago and you pay attention. You're getting deja vu now, aren't you? Like, didn't we just do this 2 days ago? Like, we're in chapter 8. I think we did this in chapter 6. Like 2 days ago in the story, Jesus is in the countryside speaking to a crowd of 5,000 people, angry, hungry men, and they had no food. And Jesus had this exact same conversation with them. They're hungry, let's give them something to eat. We don't have any food, I'll make some food. You'd think, would you not, that they'd know how to handle this by now? They just learned the lesson. And we could, as we are critical of their slowness to learn the lessons from yesterday, ask a similar question of ourselves. It seems to me that quite often when we go through something difficult in life, we act as though it's the very first time we've ever gone through something difficult in life. And we seem to forget that we're actually quite tough. In fact, we've gone through lots of things before. Some of them have been worse than this. Some of them have certainly been as bad. So maybe, given our track record of success at going through difficult things and enduring difficult times, and emerging from them safer and better and stronger, maybe, given that, we'll have no problem going through this present difficulty. We know it won't be fun, we know it will be difficulty, and there might be darkness ahead, but we will get through it. That much we know of ourselves. You'd think we'd think that way. Just 2 days ago, the disciples faced a bigger, angrier, hungrier crowd, and it all worked out just fine. But with these guys, it's like every day's the first day. Every difficulty's the first difficulty. They don't seem to learn. Next sentence. How many loaves do you have? 7, they replied. He told the crowd to sit on the ground. When he had taken the 7 loaves and given thanks, he broke them and gave them to the disciples to set before the people, and they did so. They had a few small fish as well. He gave thanks for them also and told the disciples to excuse me, I have a stutter and it doesn't often happen in public. Distribute them. The people ate and were satisfied. About 4,000 were present. I was going over this morning at my desk at home, and it just struck me again how this is quite often what our problems are like. We have, in this case, a 4,000 problem, and all we can throw at the problem is a 7 loaves and a couple of fish sort of effort. And this is where faith takes us. I've got a problem this big and resources this size. We are so often here in life. So, since the time of Augustine in the 4th century, the church have understood that the prior feeding of the 5,000 was something that Jesus did for the Jews, and the feeding of the 4,000 that we're looking at this morning was something Jesus did for the non-Jews, and that's probably right enough. And this is the point Mark seems to be making. This weird period in Jesus' life, so the woman of Tyre, who we looked at last week, she wasn't a Jew. She didn't know any of the rules, any of the traditions of the Jewish faith. And similarly, this large crowd this morning, they're either not Jews or used to be Jews. So they either don't know what the rules and traditions are, or they've simply stopped caring what the rules and traditions are. And this is the very point Mark is making. Jesus is in the wrong place with the wrong crowd, and he's working with them. These stories remind me of the book of Jonah. They have the same point. People who are regarded by religious people as being irreligious are often the very ones who are first to get it and first to understand. Next sentence. Here's the rub. Jesus goes back, I guess, to Israel, and the Pharisees come to question Jesus, to test him, and to ask him for a sign. Now remember, the Pharisees are not bad people. On the contrary, they are profoundly good people. And their goodness is expressed in trying to preserve Jewish, traditional, conservative values in the face of the aggressive, liberal values of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And the way that they sought to do that was by separating themselves from everything that was Greek. They had an almost monastic understanding of life and faith. So because they thought that the world around them, the Greek world, was inherently evil, the only way to be good and decent was to separate yourself from all of that. So in their view, you couldn't go to the gymnasium because it was too Greek. You couldn't go to the theatre because it was too Greek. You couldn't read Homer because it was too Greek. Everything was wrong. It was wrong to even set foot in the Decapolis because it was way too Greek. Their entire worldview was based on the principle of separation. You could not be a good Jew unless you rejected all of these other things. And we're told the same thing today quite often by well-meaning people. You cannot be a true Christian. You cannot be a person of faith unless you reject all of these things we tell you to reject. Unless you agree with us on all these issues, that means you're not a true Christian. And yet here Jesus comes. From having quite a successful time, it seems, in Greek Disneyland. The 24-hour party people seem to like him. They seem to respond to his message. He seems to have had remarkable success there. And in working with people who are thoroughly immersed in this culture, Jesus calls into question the attitude of the Pharisees. And so they come to Jesus. And the word "come" that Mark uses here, it's a word that he borrows from a military textbook. It means to come in battle formation. Do you know when someone visits you, you can tell if their visit is friendly or unfriendly sometimes by their demeanour? You can tell when they've got an agenda, you can tell when they're upset, you can tell by the way they walk and by the tone of their voice and the look on their face. There's something they want to get off their chest, they're not happy. This is this word Mark is using. They come to Jesus with an agenda to question him. When you read through the Gospels and you come to these parts where people ask Jesus questions, you have to understand they're not real questions. A real question is what? A real question is a collection of words designed to elicit information. That's a real question. The Pharisees ask malicious questions, trick questions designed to trap you. These are the kind of questions your wife asks you. Okay? There's no right answer. There's only wrong answers. So these are the questions of the Pharisees. They're never asking him a true question, only a bad one to trip him up. End of verse 11. To test him, they ask for a sign from heaven. The word "test" there is a word that in the ancient world means to ascertain whether or not something is genuine. So if your uncle passed on and he left you his gold pocket watch and you decided to go to a pawn shop and cash it in for money, I suppose that'd be quite an uncaring thing to do, but anyway. So you take your uncle's gold pocket watch to the pawn shop and you say, "How much will you give me for this gold pocket watch?" The owner of the pawn shop would say, "Well, hang on. You say it's a gold pocket watch, but first of all I need to ascertain whether it's genuine. I need to test it. I need to look for the right hallmarks. I need to see if what you say is gold is actually gold." This is the exact meaning of the word "test" in the New Testament. Jesus, you say you've got a message from God. You say you've got a new way of doing things and understanding things that will make life better for all. And you're taking this message not to the right people, but to the wrong people. You're taking it into places where we, in our purity, would never even think of setting foot. And so we just need to test whether or not you're the real deal, whether or not you're genuine, whether or not your faith is pure and your message is to be believed. And so they ask Jesus for a sign from heaven. Now, we've only read 7 chapters of the story, but it seems to me this is a bizarre request. I mean, Jesus has been doing some pretty big things so far, has he not? Yesterday he fed 4,000 people with a couple of fish and a few loaves. A few days before that he fed 5,000 people with a similar amount of food. He's healed people, has he not? He's raised a few people from the dead, has he not? There's been quite a lot of things going on in the life of Jesus, and yet, and they are aware of those things, and yet they come to him and they ask for a sign. The problem that they're having is that Jesus is doing what he's doing with the wrong people. And this wrongness is radically challenging their most fundamental belief that we should separate ourselves from those people, that we should judge those people, that we should be able to assume that because their life does not fit in with this box, that means they don't have faith and aren't worth bothering with. And so understand then that in verse 11, when they ask Jesus a question, and they ask him for a sign from heaven, they're not asking him a question. And nor are they asking for a sign from heaven. What they're really doing is expressing their displeasure at the fact that Jesus is stepping outside of their box. And in so doing, suggesting that it is possible to be a person of faith outside of the predetermined rules and traditions that these people of faith have laid down. They're angry that Jesus is hanging out with the wrong crowd. And they mask this anger with the vocabulary of religion. They don't believe Jesus is from God. They don't believe Jesus is doing the work of God. And no amount of questioning and no amount of sign giving is going to change that. And yet they mask their unbelief in the language of belief. It's ironic, isn't it? What they're really saying here is, Jesus, we're asking you for a sign to help us believe because we actually have no intention of ever believing. So what we really want is proof that you are wrong because we know that you're wrong. You can't work with those people. You can't win with those people. They've already decided what you are. Next sentence, Jesus hears their pious vocabulary, the right words. They're wearing the right clothes. They've just come from the right meetings. They've got all the right morals. They can tick all the right boxes. And he hears it and he sees it. And the text says he sighs deeply. So this in the Gospels is a low point in Jesus' emotional life. The phrase sighed deeply is quite rare in ancient literature, and it's only ever used to describe situations in which a person is pushed to the limits of what they can bear emotionally. Jesus is now at this place where he's thinking, I can't win with these people. It doesn't matter what I say, it doesn't matter what I do. They just don't get it. And what's so frustrating to me right now is, the 21-year-olds I was talking to last night, the morning after the night before, they got it. The woman of Tyre who I met with yesterday, who's never opened a Bible in her life, She got it. And yet these people who've been reading the Bible since they were born, who understand it back to front and inside out, they don't get it. And so he sighs deeply, pulls out a few of his hairs, and then he says, why does this generation ask for a sign? No sign will be given to it. So in the Bible, the demand for unmistakable proof of Jesus' credibility is a rejection of the summons to faith, which is so integral to the Christian gospel. Unbelief can never be alleviated by proof or evidence, because people who don't want to believe won't believe. They will always find grounds for disbelief, especially if it means abandoning their preconceived ideas. God, don't take this the wrong way or think less of me for saying this, but God cannot be proven. Can't be. If God could be proven beyond a shadow of a doubt, he would be less than God. We can prove most things by putting them under a microscope and analysing them and studying them and learning everything there is to learn about them. And in everything that we study in our humanity, we place ourselves above the object of our investigation and learn. God cannot be put under a microscope or analysed. We cannot place ourselves above him and learn everything there is to learn about him or get to the end of him. If we could, he would be no God worth knowing or following. Similarly with faith, it can't be proven, nor can it be tried. It can only be trusted. We'll never know everything there is to know about Jesus. We will always have more questions than we do answers. But you know what? At some point in this filthy, beautiful life, in this life of ups and downs, of successes and failures and good times and disappointments and great joys and terrible heartaches, at some point in all of it, we're going to have to just trust Jesus. And be willing to put our hand in the hand of God. And as the poem says, trod happily into the darkness, believing it will take us to a new and a beautiful day. These people didn't want to trust Jesus. They wanted to trust what they already knew. And so symbolically, the sentence ends by telling us that Jesus left them and went into a boat, probably back to Greek Disneyland, where the people were still waiting, hungry and willing to learn more. Any questions on any of that? Our Father in heaven, we have been through so many things before, and we remember with gratitude how we were able to go through those things. We remember with gratitude the various ways in which our faith in you has helped us over the years. Though we have not followed you perfectly, we still this morning find ourselves believing. Believing and believing and believing and believing. And so as we face the unknowns of this week, like generations before us, we place our hand into the hand of God and trod happily forward, believing that you will lead us toward the light and new and better days. We keep believing for our families too, for the people we love. We ask you to be with them this morning wherever they are. We know they have their own journey. And we know as you were there on ours, you will be with them on theirs. We leave then here with faith and with trust, knowing that you are with us. Hear our prayer through Christ our Lord. Amen.